Good evening, all. Today we are going to study about the balance of yesterday's chapter, the making of nationalism in Europe. If you look at the map of mid 18th century Europe, you will find that there were no nation state as we know them today. What we know today as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland were divided into kingdoms, duchies, and cantons whose rulers had their autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe were under autocratic monarchies within the territories of which lived diverse peoples. They did not see themselves as sharing a collective identity or a common culture. Often, they even spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire that ruled over Austria Hungary, for example, was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples. It included the Alpine regions, the Tyrol, Austria, and the Sudetenland, as well as Bohemia, where the aristocracy was predominantly German speaking. It also included the Italian speaking provinces of Lombardy and Venetia. In Hungary, half of the population spoke Magyar while the other half spoke a variety of dialects. In Galicia, the aristocracy spoke Polish. Besides these three dominant groups, there also lived within the boundaries of the empire a mass of subject peasant peoples, Bohemians and Slovaks to the north, Slovenes in Carniola, Croats to the south, and Romans to the east in Transylvania. Such differences did not easily promote a sense of political unity. The only tie binding these diverse groups together was a common allegiance to the power. How did nationalism and the idea of nation state emerge? The making of nationalism in Europe. The paragraph explains how Europe was divided before nationalism developed. Europe before nationalism. In the mid 18th century, there were no modern nation states like today. Europe was divided into many kingdoms, duchies, empires, and territories. Each region had different rules and political systems, different peoples and languages. The people living in these regions did not share one common identity, spoke different languages, and belonged to different ethnic groups. The huge empire called the Habsburg Empire included many groups such as Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Bohemians, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, and others. So, one empire contained many cultures and languages. What was the Habsburg Empire? Habsburg Empire. It was ruled by Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. The empire included areas of present-day Austria, Hungary, parts of Italy, Czech Republic, Croatia, and other regions. Aristocracy and peasants. The paragraph also talks about social groups like aristocracy are rich landowners and noble families who controlled power and land. They owned estates in different regions, spoke French for diplomacy, and shared similar lifestyles across Europe. Peasants, common farmers and workers who usually had less power, spoke local languages and lived according to regional traditions. Main idea of the page: Europe was politically and culturally divided. People identified more with their ruler, local region, language, or religion rather than with a nation. Later, the idea of nationalism united people with a common language, culture, and history into nation states. Coming to the next paragraph, the aristocracy and the new middle class. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant class on the continent. The members of this class were united by a common way of life that cut across regional divisions. They owned estates in the countryside and also townhouses. They spoke French for purposes of diplomacy and in high society. Their families were often connected by ties of marriage. This powerful aristocracy was, however, numerically a small group. The majority of the population was made up of the peasantry. To the west, the bulk of the land was farmed by tenants and small owners, while in eastern and central Europe, the pattern of land holding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. The aristocracy and the new middle class. Who were the aristocracy? The aristocracy were the rich and powerful landowners of Europe. Okay, the aristocracy were the rich and powerful people or powerful landowners of Europe. They owned huge lands and big houses, lived a luxurious life, spoke French in high society, were connected through marriages between rich families. Even though they were very powerful, they were actually small in number. Who formed the majority? Most people in Europe were peasants, that is, farmers and poor villagers. In Western Europe, land was mostly formed by tenants, that is, people renting land, and small landowners. In Eastern and Central Europe, there were huge estates worked by serfs. Who are or what are serfs? Serfs are peasants who were forced to work for landlords. They had very little freedom and were almost like bonded laborers. Growth of the new middle class. What changed because of industrialization? Industrialization means the growth of factories, machines, industries, trade, and business. It first began in England in the late 18th century. Later, it spread to France, German states, and other European countries. What new social groups appeared? Because industries and trade increased, new groups emerged. They were working class, middle class. Working class, people who worked in factories and industries. Middle class included industrialists, businessmen, professionals like doctors, lawyers, teachers. This educated middle class became very important. Why is the middle class important in nationalism? The educated middle class supported freedom, equality, removal of aristocratic privileges, and national unity. They spread ideas of nationalism and wanted nations to unite. Aristocracy. Rich landowners with power, peasants, majority population working on land, serfs, forced laborers in Eastern Europe, working class, factory workers after industrialization, and middle class, educated businessmen and professionals supporting nationalism. Line by line explanation. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant class on the continent. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy means in Europe, the people who owned large lands were called landed aristocracy. They were the most powerful group in society and politics. So, what is this landed aristocracy? They were group of people who were dominant in the continent. Socially and politically, they were most powerful people. The members of this class were united by a common way of life that cut across regional divisions. Aristocrats from different European regions lived in a similar style. Even if they belonged to different countries, their lifestyle was almost the same. They owned estates in the countrysides and also town houses. They spoke French for purposes of diplomacy and in high society. Their families were connected by ties of marriage. This powerful aristocracy was, however, numerically a small group. So, this is this paragraph is mostly saying about the aristocrats. What are the features of these aristocrats people? They had huge lands and mansions in villages. They also owned expensive houses in cities. They spoke French for purposes of diplomacy and in high society. French was considered the language of rich and educated people. Aristocrats used French while talking in royal courts and official meetings. Their families were often connected by ties of marriage, means rich aristocratic families married among themselves. This helped them maintain wealth and power. Although they were powerful, their population was very small compared to ordinary people. Most people in Europe were peasants. Now, the next population is about peasants. The majority of the population was made up of peasantry. To the west, The bulk of the land was farmed by tenants and small owners, while in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of landholding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. So, here they are saying about peasants, peasants and serfs. Peasants were belonging to the west, whereas serfs were belonging to the Eastern and Central Europe. Sorry, this was not peasants, this is tenants. The majority, most people in Europe were peasants. They were farmers and poor villagers. In Western Europe, farming was mostly done by tenants, that are people renting land, and small farmers who owned little land. While in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of land holding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. In Eastern and Central Europe, huge lands belonged to rich landlords. These landlords were worked by serfs, that is, poor laborers forced to work for landlords. They are called as serfs. Coming to the next paragraph. In western parts of Central Europe, the growth of industrial production and trade meant the growth of towns and the emergence of commercial class whose existence was based on production for the market. Industries and trade increased in Western Europe. Because of this, towns and cities developed rapidly. A new business class appeared. They earned money by producing and selling goods in market. Industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of German states it occurred only during the 19th century. This is very important, it has been asked repeatedly in exams. That is, industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century. So, industrialization first appeared in which of the European countries? It is first appeared in England during the half of 18th century, during the second half of 18th century, but in other countries like France and parts of German states it occurred only during the 19th century. Their industrialization began during the 19th century, whereas in England industrialization started at the second half of the 18th century. In its wake, new social groups came into being, a working class population and a middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen, professionals. Industrialization created new types of people in society. They were working class population. Factory workers and laborers formed the working class. Then a middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen and professionals. The middle class included factory owners, traders, doctors, lawyers, teachers and other educated professionals. So here it's saying that as a result of industrialization, new social groups came into being. They were a working class population and a middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen and professionals. So as a result of industrialization, two types of communities occurred or developed. They were first one was working class, second one was middle class. Working class people involved those of factory workers and laborers, whereas middle class included industrialists, businessmen, and professionals. In Central and Eastern Europe, these groups were smaller in number till late 19th century. In Eastern Europe, industries developed slowly. So the middle class and working class remained small for a long time. It was among the educated, liberal middle class that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. Educated middle class people supported freedom, equality, and national unity. They wanted to end special privileges of aristocrats. Nationalism became popular mainly among them. So, in Central and Eastern Europe, these groups, these working class people and middle class people, were smaller in number till the late 19th century. It was among the educated liberal middle classes that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. Next paragraph. Before going to the next paragraph, we can have a little short about this aristocrat and middle class people. The aristocracy and the new middle class. Aristocracy. Landed aristocracy. Landed aristocracy was the most powerful class in Europe. They owned large estates in villages and houses in towns. The aristocrats across Europe shared a similar lifestyle. French was the common language of diplomacy and high society. The aristocratic families were mostly connected by marriages, though powerful aristocrats were small in number. Next coming group is peasantry and serfs. Most Europeans were peasants. In Western Europe, land was farmed by tenants and small landowners. In Eastern and Central Europe, huge estates existed. These were cultivated by serfs. Serfs were forced laborers tied to the land. They had very little freedom. Growth of the new middle class. Industrialization. Industrialization first began in England in the late or second half of the 18th century. In other countries like France and the German states, the industrialization started during the 19th century. Growth of industries and trade led to the growth of towns. New social groups. As a result of industrialization, new social groups were formed. They were working class and middle class. Working class included factory workers and laborers, whereas middle class included industrialists, businessmen, professionals like doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Role of middle class. Educated middle class supported freedom, equality, abolition of aristocratic privileges, and national unity. Nationalist ideas became popular among them. So next one is, what did liberal nationalism stand for? Liberal nationalism. This is very important topic of this chapter and of the history itself. Liberal nationalism. It's asked more than 5 or 6 times in the exam, board exam, final exam. So this liberal nationalism and this paragraph, nearly one, two, three, four paragraphs are very important. So coming to the first paragraph, ideas of national unity in early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. In the 1800s, people in Europe connected the idea of national unity with liberalism. Liberalism means supporting freedom and equal rights. The ideas of national unity in the early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. The term liberalism derives from the Latin root liber, meaning free. So, liberalism derived from the Latin word liber, which means free. It comes from the Latin word liber, liber means free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before law. So, for the new middle class people, liberalism stood for freedom of the individual and equality of all before law. Freedom and equality. For new middle class people, this liberalism means freedom of the individual and equality of all before law. Politically, it emphasized the concept of government by consent. Government by consent. Politically, it means the concept of government by consent. What do you mean by government by consent? Okay. Government by consent means a government gets its power and authority from the approval of the people. In simple words, people choose their rulers. Citizens agreed to be governed by them. This consent is usually given through elections and votings. In a democracy like India, people vote in elections. The leaders who win form the government. So the government rules with the consent or permission or support of the people. Opposite idea, a king or dictator ruling without asking people's opinion is not a government by consent. Okay. Since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges. a constitution and a representative government through parliament. So, since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges. It means a constitution and a representative government through a parliament. 19th century liberals also stressed the inviolability of private property. So, they also want right to property. That is, the right to property should not be violated. The term liberalism derives from the Latin root liber meaning free. That is, word liberalism comes from the Latin word liber. Liber means free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom of the individual and equality of all before the law. The educated middle class wanted personal freedom, equal treatment under law. They believed nobody should get special treatment because of birth or status. Politically, it emphasized the concept of government by consent. Liberalism believed that a government should rule only with the approval of the people. People should have a say in choosing the government. Since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges. After the French Revolution, liberals opposed autocracy, that is, ruled by one king with absolute power and special privileges of church officials. A constitution and a representative government through parliament. Liberals wanted a constitution, that is, set of laws limiting government power, and a representative government where elected people make laws in the parliament. 19th century liberals also stressed the inviolability of private property. Liberals believed private property should be protected. Nobody should take away a person's property unfairly. So, quick revision: liberalism stood for freedom of individuals, equality before law, government by consent, end of autocracy, end of church privileges, constitution, representative government, and protection of private property. These 8 things are very important, 8 points are very important. First one is liberalism stood for freedom of individuals, freedom, equality, a government by consent, end of autocracy, end of church privileges, constitution, representative government, protection of private property. First one is freedom, second one is equality, third one consent by a government, fourth one end of churches, end of autocracy, and need a constitution, need a parliament, then protection of right to private property, then a representative government is needed. These 8 points are very important, and we can expect the question from this paragraph for nearly 5 or 3 marks. Next paragraph. Yet equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. What is suffrage means? Suffrage means the right to vote. Yet equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage, meaning, even though liberals supported equality before law, yes, liberals supported equality before law, they did not support voting rights for everyone. Okay. Universal suffrage means the right of all adults to vote. Since liberals supported the equality before law, liberals wanted equality before law, they want the idea that all should be equal before law, but they did not support voting rights for everyone. You will recall that in revolutionary France, which marked the first political experiment in liberal democracy. During the French Revolution, France tried liberal democracy for the first time. People began demanding freedom and political rights. So it was during the French Revolution, France tried the liberal democracy for the first time. That means all the people began demanding freedom and political rights. The right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property owning men. Only men who owned property were allowed to vote and to get contest elections. Poor men and women had no such rights. Okay. So the right to vote was only there for property owning men. For those who have property, they have the right to vote or can conduct elections. There were no voting rights for poor people and women. But it was during the French Revolution, France tried the liberal democracy for the first time. That means during the French Revolution, the France has tried for a liberal democracy where everyone has the right to vote. Men without property and all women were excluded from political rights. Poor men who owned no property could not vote. Women were completely denied political rights. So no women were allowed to vote. They do not have voting rights. Only for a brief period under the Jacobins did all adult males enjoy suffrage. During the rule of the Jacobins in France, all adult men get voting rights for a short time. This period did not last long. During France, there was a time when there was the ruling of Jacobins was there. So at the time of this ruling by Jacobins, all adult men got the voting rights for a short time. The period does not last long. However, the Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage. Napoleon again restricted voting rights. Only selected people could vote. At the time of the Napoleon also, only selected people were allowed to vote. And reduced women to the status of a minor subject to the authority of fathers and husbands. Women were treated as dependent persons. So women were always treated as, at the time of French Revolution or at the time of Napoleon, the woman was treated as a dependent person. They were dependent either on their husband or on their father. They had to obey their fathers before marriage and husbands after marriage. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. In the 1800 and early 1900s, that is 19th and 20th century, women and poor men fought for equal, they fight for equal voting and political rights. They organized protests and movements for equality. So, quick revision: liberalism had limitations. Equality before law does not mean voting rights for all. Only property owning men could vote. Men and poor men were excluded. Jacobins briefly give voting rights to all adult men. Napoleon again restricted suffrage. Women and poor people later fought for equal political rights. Okay. Equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage. That means equality doesn't mean all have equal right to vote. You will recall that in revolutionary France, which marked the first political experiment in liberal democracy, the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property owning men. So only property owning men were allowed to get elected and right to vote. Men without property and all women were excluded from political rights. Only for a brief period under the Jacobins did all adult males enjoy suffrage. However, the Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage and reduced women to the status of minor, subject to the authority of fathers and husbands. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. So, the main important point is that the equality doesn't mean universal suffrage, and also the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to the property owning men. Men without property and all women were excluded. They do not have political rights or right to vote. And during a brief period of Jacobins, all adult males enjoy suffrage, but it doesn't last long. And in the Napoleonic Code also, there was limited suffrage was given and woman was reduced to the status of a minor, subject to the authority of their fathers and husbands. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. Coming to the next paragraph. In the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and abolition of state imposed restrictions on the government on the movement of goods and capital. So, in the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. Economically, liberals wanted free trade, free buying and selling, and fewer government restrictions. Goods and money should move freely from one place to another. Okay. During the 19th century, this was a strong demand of the emerging middle classes. The growing middle class strongly supported free markets. Businessmen and traders wanted fewer trade barriers. Let us take the example of the German speaking regions in the first half of the 19th century. The book now gives Germany as an example to explain these problems. Okay. Napoleon's administrative measures had created out of countless small principalities of a confederation of 39 states. Earlier, German regions were divided into many tiny states. Napoleon reorganized them into a group of 39 states called a confederation. Each of these possessed its own currency and weights and measures. Every state had its own money, its own measuring system. This created confusion in trade. A merchant traveling in 1833 from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would have had to pass through 11 custom barriers. A trader traveling between German states had to cross many checkpoints. Between Hamburg and Nuremberg, there were 11 custom barriers and pay a customs duty of about 5% at each one of them. At every checkpoint, the trader had to pay tax on goods. This made trade expensive. Duties were often levied according to the weight or measurement of the goods. Taxes depended on the size or weight of products. As each region had its own system of weights and measures, this involved time consuming calculation. Since every region used different measurements, traders had to constantly calculate and convert units. This wasted a lot of time. The measure of cloth, for example, was the elli, which in each region stood for a different length. Cloth was measured using a unit called LA, but the length of one LA was different in different places. An LA of textile material bought in Frankfurt would get you 54.7 centimeter of cloth, in Mainz 55.1 centimeter, and in Nuremberg 65.6 centimeter, and in Freiburg 53.5 centimeter. The same unit LA had different length in different cities. This caused confusion and difficulties in trade. Quick revision. Economic liberalism supported free markets, wanted removal of trade restrictions, good and capital should move freely. Problems in German states. Germany had 39 states. Different currencies and measurements existed. Many custom barriers and taxes slowed trade. Different measurement systems created confusion. Liberalism. Liberalism. Idea supporting freedom and equality. Customs duty tax on goods crossing borders. Confederation. Group of states united together. Capital. Money used for business and trade. LA. Unit used to measure cloth. So, in the economic sphere, the liberalism stood for the freedom of market, and this paragraph is not that much important. Only one question that has been asked before 2020 board exam. So, this is not that much important. In the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of market and the abolition of state imposed restrictions on the government on the movement of goods and capital. So, in the case of economic sphere, what does this liberalism means? That means freedom of markets and the abolition of state imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. So, the state has imposed certain restrictions on the movement of these goods and capital. So, abolition of these state imposed restrictions and freedom of market, giving market freedom, is what is mean by liberalism in the case of economic sphere. Or economically speaking, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and abolition of state imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. During the 19th century, this was a strong demand of the emerging middle class. Let us take the example of the German speaking regions in the first half of the 19th century. Napoleon's administrative measures had created out of countless small principalities of a confederation of 39 states. Each of these possessed its own currency, weights, and measures. A merchant traveling in 1833 from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would have to pass through 11 custom barriers and pay a customs duty of about 5% of each one of them. Duties were often levied according to the weight or measurement of the goods. As such region had its own system of weights and measures, this involved time consuming calculation. The measure of cloth, for example, was the LA, which in each region stood for a different length. An LA of textile material bought in Frankfurt would get you 54.7 centimeter of cloth, in Mainz 55.1 centimeter, in Nuremberg 65.6 centimeter, and in Freiburg 53.5 centimeter. What you have to study here is each during the time there was a confederation of 39 states, and each of the state possesses its own currency, weights, and measures. For example, you can think in case of India. Imagine if India has 28 states total. So in each state there is different currency, different weights, and different measurements. It will be very difficult for doing trade, business, etc., while moving from one state to another. So similarly, at the time of this revolution or Napoleon's time, Napoleon has a countless principalities of a federation of 39 states, and each state possesses its own currency and weights and measures. And the same examples are given in the case of LA and in the case of custom barriers. Earlier, German regions were divided into many tiny states. Napoleon reorganized them into a group of 39 states called a confederation. Every state had its own money, its own measuring system. This created a confusion in trade. A trader traveling between German states had to cross many tax checkpoints. between Hamburg and Nuremberg, there were 11 custom barriers. And at every checkpoint, the trader has to pay tax on goods. So, at 11 custom barriers, what the trader has to do, he has to pay tax. This made trade expensive. Duties were often levied according to the weight or measurement of the goods. Taxes depended on the size or weight of products. Since every region used different measurements, traders had to constantly calculate and convert units. This wasted a lot of time. The measure of cloth, for example, was the LA, which in each region stood for a different length. Cloth was measured using a unit called LA, but the length of one LA was different in different places. An LA of textile material bought in Frankfurt would get you 54.7 centimeter of cloth, in Mainz 55.1 centimeter, in Nuremberg 65.6 centimeter, and in Freiburg 53.5 centimeter. The same unit LA had different length in different cities. This caused confusion and difficulties in trade. Quick revision. Economic liberalism supported free markets, wanted removal of trade restrictions, goods and capital should move freely. Problems in German state. Germany had 39 states, different currencies and measurements existed, many custom barriers and taxes slowed trade, different measurement system created confusion. So different currencies were there, different measurement system were there, different weights were there, and this all created confusion in trades and markets. Next paragraph. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes. The new business class felt that too many taxes and different systems were blocking trade and economic growth. These problems made business difficult. The new business class felt that too many taxes and different systems were blocking trade and economic growth. These problems made business difficult. Who argued for the creation of a unified economic territory allowed the unhindered movement of goods, people, and capital. Businessmen wanted one large economic area without barriers. They wanted free movement of goods, free movement of people, and free movement of money or capital. In 1834, a customs union or Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. In 1834, Prussia created a customs union called Zollverein. Most German states joined it, Zollverein. It was a union to remove trade barriers between German states. The Union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. Sullivan removed the customs taxes between states. It also reduced many different currencies to only two. This made trade easier. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated mobility. Railways improved transportation. People and goods could move faster from one place to another. Harnessing economic interests to national unification. Economic benefits encouraged people to support German unity. Trade and business helped unite German states. A wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at that time. Economic nationalism means supporting one's nation's economy and unity. This increased feelings of nationalism among Germans. Quick revision. Problems before Solvary. Many custom barriers were there, different currencies was there, different measurement systems was there, trade became difficult. In Solvary was introduced in 1834, started by Prussia. Customs Union of German states removed tariff barriers, reduced currencies, and encouraged free trade. Importance of railways: improved transport, increased trade, helped German unification. So Solverin is a customs union formed by German states. Tariff barrier, tax on goods crossing borders. Economic nationalism, supporting national economic unity. Mobility, easy movement of people and goods. So this paragraph explains about such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes, who argued for the creation of a unified economic territory allowing the unhindered movement of goods, people and capital. In 1834, a custom union or Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. The union abolished tariff barriers. This customs union, that is Zollverein, abolished the tariff barriers or stopped the tariff barriers. What is tariff barriers? Tariff barriers means they are tax on goods crossing borders. If a person or a tradesman crosses borders, then he will have to pay tax, and that tax are called tariff barriers. And this union or this sovereign abolished tariff barriers or taxes that are paid on crossing the borders. These taxes were abolished, were stopped, and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. The currencies were reduced from 30 to 2. So instead of 30 currencies, now they have to carry or exchange only 2 currencies. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated mobility. So, the network of railways or the creation of railways further stimulated mobility. Mobility means easy movement of people and good occurred from one place to another. Harnessing the economic interest to national unification. A wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at a time. And as a result, this economic nationalism strengthened with wider nationalist sentiments growing at a time. So this paragraph explains about the growth of economic nationalism. The main points discussed here. sovereign, where this sovereign and railways. These are the two important points discussed in this paragraph. Next is a new conservatism after 1815. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. So Napoleon got defeated in 1815. European rulers wanted to protect old traditions and old systems. This thinking was called conservatism. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. Conservatives believed that established traditional institutions of state and society, like the monarchy, the church, social hierarchies, property, and the family, should be preserved. Conservatives wanted to protect traditional institutions such as monarchy, that is, role of kings, church, social class system, private property, and family values. They believed these were important for stability. Most conservatives, however, did not propose a return to the society of pre revolutionary days. Conservatives did not want to completely go back to the old system before the French Revolution. Conservatives did not want to completely go back to the old system before the French Revolution. They understood that some changes had already happened. Rather, they realized from the changes initiated by Napoleon that modernization could, in fact, strengthen traditional institutions like the monarchy. Conservatives noticed that some modern reforms introduced by Napoleon were useful. They believed modern systems could actually make monarchies stronger. It could make state power more effective and strong. Modernization could improve the power and efficiency of governments. A modern army, an efficient bureaucracy, a dynamic economy, the abolition of feudalism and serfdom. Conservatives supported a strong modern army, better government administration or bureaucracy, economic development, ending feudalism, and ending serfdom could strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. They believed these reforms would make kings and monarchies more powerful and stable. Quick revision. Conservatism began after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, wanted to preserve monarchy, church, social hierarchy, property, family system. Conservatives also accepted some modern reforms like modern army, efficient bureaucracy, dynamic economy, end of feudalism, end of serfdom. Main idea. Conservatives wanted to preserve traditional monarchy while using modern reforms to strengthen the state. A new conservatism after 1815. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. Conservatives believed that established traditional institutions of state and society like the monarchy, the church, social hierarchies, property, and the family should be preserved. Most conservatives, however, did not propose a return to the society of pre revolutionary days. Rather, they realized from the changes initiated by Napoleon that modernization could in fact strengthen the traditional institutions like the monarchy. It could make state power more effective and strong. A modern army, an efficient bureaucracy, a dynamic economy, and the abolition of feudalism and serfdom could strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. So here in this paragraph, first it is saying that the Napoleon was defeated in 1815. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. Conservatives were those people who believed that traditional institutions of state and society like monarchy, the church, social hierarchies, property, and the family should be preserved. Also, the conservatives did not want to go back to the pre revolutionary days, that is, before the French Revolution. What was the stage of the country? They didn't want to go into that stage. Rather, they respected or they initiated some of the modernization techniques that were used by Napoleon to strengthen the traditional institutions like the monarchy. They believed that this modernization could make the state power more effective and strong, such as a modern army, also an efficient bureaucracy, a dynamic economy, as well as the abolition of feudalism and serfdom can strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. Conservatism, a political philosophy that stressed the importance of tradition, established institutions and customs, and preferred gradual development to quick change. So while going to the next paragraph, in 1815, representatives of European powers, that is Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, who had collectively defeated Napoleon, met at Vienna to draw up a settlement for Europe. In 1815, major European countries, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, they met in Vienna after defeating Napoleon. So the Napoleon was defeated by the combination of four countries, four European countries, which were they? Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. So after defeating Napoleon, these four countries or the representatives of these four countries met in Vienna in 1815. Their aim was to decide how Europe should be reorganized. They met at Vienna for discussing or considering for the reorganization of Europe. The Congress was hosted by the Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich. The meeting was led by the Austria's Chancellor Duke Metternich. This meeting is called the Congress of Vienna. So the meeting at this Vienna is led by Austria's Chancellor. His name was Duke Metternich. And this meeting is called the Congress of Vienna. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna of 1815 with the object of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. The leaders signed the Treaty of Vienna in 1815. Their goal was to reverse many changes made by Napoleon during his rule. So the Treaty of Vienna or Congress of Vienna in 1815 was signed by the leaders. Their goal, what was their goal? Was to reverse many changes made by the Napoleon during his rule. During the time of Napoleon, he introduced many systems or many laws. So the Treaty of Vienna was mainly considered or mainly organized to reverse back that rules made by Napoleon to the original. That is, to take away the changes that made by Napoleon during his rule. The Bourbon dynasty, which had been deposed during the French Revolution, was restored to power. The Bourbon royal family of France, removed during the French Revolution, was brought back to rule France again. So, during the French Revolution, one of the royal family, it's Bourbon royal family. It's not Bourbon biscuits, it's Bourbon royal family. They were removed during the French Revolution. So, once this royal family was removed, it was again brought back to rule by the France through the Treaty of Vienna. And France lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. France had to give back lands captured by Napoleon. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in future. Strong states were created around France. Strong states were created around France. This was done to stop France from becoming powerful again. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in future. So in order to prevent the France from becoming powerful again, a strong states were created around France. Thus the kingdom of the Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in the north. In the north of France, the Kingdom of Netherlands was formed. It included Belgium. So, to the north of France, which kingdom was formed? Netherlands kingdom was formed. And it included which country? Belgium. And Genoa was added to the Piedmont in the south. In southern Europe, Genoa was joined with Piedmont to strengthen it against France. Prussia was given important new territories on its western frontiers. So Prussia received new lands near France. This strengthened Prussia. While Austria was given control of northern Italy, and Austria got control over northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. The group of 39 states created by Napoleon continued to exist. In the east, Russia was given part of Poland, while Prussia was given a portion of Saxony. Russia got some Polish territory. Prussia received part of Saxony. The main intention was to restore the monarchies that had been overthrown by Napoleon. The main aim of the Congress of Vienna was to bring back kings and monarchies removed by Napoleon and create a new conservative order in Europe. European leaders wanted a conservative system based on monarchy, traditional institutions, and stability. Quick revision. Congress of Vienna in 1815 was held after Napoleon's defeat. It was hosted by Duke Metternich in Vienna. Main powers is Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Main objectives: restore monarchies, reverse Napoleonic changes, create balance of power, and prevent future French expansion. Important decisions: Bourbon dynasty restored in France and bring back monarchy. France lost conquered territories to weaken the France. Netherlands formed with Belgium, prevent French expansion. Genoa added to Piedmont, strengthened southern border. Austria got northern Italy, increased the Austrian influence. Prussia gained territories that strengthened against France, and Russia got part of Poland. That was an expansion for territory. In 1815, representatives of the European powers, that are Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, who had collectively defeated Napoleon. These countries collectively defeated Napoleon, met at Vienna to draw up a settlement for Europe. So, these countries, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, collectively defeated Napoleon, and they met at Vienna to draw a settlement for Europe. The Congress was hosted by Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna of 1815 with the object of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. The Bourbon dynasty, which had been deposed during French Revolution, was restored to power. France lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in future. Thus, the Kingdom of Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in the north, and Genoa was added to the Piedmont on the south. Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in north, and Genoa was added to the Piedmont in south. Prussia was given important new territories on its own western frontiers, while Austria was given the control of northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. In the east, Russia was given part of Poland, and Prussia was given portion of Saxony. The main intention was to restore the monarchies that had been overthrown by Napoleon and create a conservative order in Europe. Restore the monarchies that has been overthrown by Napoleon was the main intention of Treaty of Vienna. Okay. Next, conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic. The governments formed after 1815 was mostly autocratic. Autocratic means power was concentrated in the hands of kings or rulers. So government formed after 1815 was mostly autocratic. Autocratic means the power lies in the hands of kings and rulers. They did not tolerate criticism and dissent. These governments did not allow people to criticize them. They opposed dissent. That is, dissent means disagreement against the government policies, and sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. They tried to stop movements or activities that challenged the authority of kings and rulers, so that the people will not get a chance to criticize the government. So they stopped all the movements and activities that cause problem to the people. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, book, plays and songs. Government introduced censorship laws. That means they controlled the newspapers, books, dramas and songs. Anything against the government was banned, and reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. They especially feared ideas like liberty, equality, freedom, which came from the French Revolution. And here is a cartoon showing the Club of Thinkers. The cartoon makes fun of conservative governments. The rulers were afraid of people expressing opinions freely. Members are shown wearing muzzles to stop them from speaking. Rules shown in the cartoon. Silence is the first rule. Muzzles are given so nobody speaks freely. This shows how freedom of speech was suppressed. The memory of the French Revolution nonetheless continued to inspire liberals. Even though governments tried to suppress freedom, people still remembered the French Revolution. Liberals continued to get inspiration from its ideas. One of the major issues taken up by the liberal nationalists who criticized the new conservative order was freedom of press. Liberal nationalists strongly demanded freedom of press. They wanted newspapers and writers to speak freely without government control. Quick revision. Conservative governments after 1850 were autocratic, that is, power lies in the hands of rulers and kings, opposed criticism and dissent, imposed censorship laws, feared ideas of liberty and freedom. Liberal nationalists demanded freedom of speech, freedom of press, end of censorship, and more political rights. Important terms: autocratic. Autocratic means ruled by one powerful ruler. Dissent means disagreement against government. Censorship, government control over speech and writing. Freedom of press, right to publish opinions freely. So, coming to this, the conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic. They did not tolerate criticism and dissent, sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers. So, censorship laws were introduced to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, and songs that reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. The memory of the French Revolution nonetheless continued to inspire liberals. One of the major issues taken up by the liberal nationalists who criticized the new conservative order was freedom of press. That is, they needed to remove the imposed censorship laws on them so that they can express their freedom of speech. And in this cartoon, there is shown the club of thinkers, anonymous caricature dating to c 1820. The plaque on the left bears the inscription: the most important question of today's meeting: how long will thinking be allowed to us? The board on the right lists the rules of the club, which include the following: silence is the first commandment of this learned society. To avoid the eventuality whereby a member of this club may succumb to the temptation of speech, muscles will be distributed to members upon entering. That is, they were not allowed to speak, and the silence was the main commandment of this learned society. And this was the major features of conservatism or conservatives. Now, one more paragraph is there. We have to study about the revolutionaries that we can study tomorrow. And coming to the last section. So we can